Hey everyone, welcome back. And we're going to continue on with part two of the New Energy Systems part of the program. For those of you that missed part one, I'm Dave Nicolation. I'm with a strategic advisor with McCarthy Tetro, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'll be introducing each of the speakers as they just before they do their presentation, and then we'll gather again for a Q&A afterwards. Just to let everyone know, there's going to be a slight adjustment to the order. Stephen Appleton is still just joining us, so I'll move him to the end of this session, and we'll start with Ian Mcgregor. So Ian is Ian Mcgregor serves as executive chairman of Hydrogen Naturally, which produces carbon negative hydrogen known as bright green hydrogen. Ian is a transformative investor, entrepreneur, and pioneer of globally recognized sustainable energy projects. Over to you, Ian.
Okay, thanks. First, I want to say thanks for giving me the chance to speak today and tell you about what I'm doing. I also want to acknowledge that I'm from Calgary. I'm on the traditional territories of People 7, and that's also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I'm privileged to be allowed to live and work here. So I want to tell you our story about something we call bright green hydrogen. And it's essentially we're trying to use scrap wood fiber and make hydrogen out of it. And our goal is to sequester a gigaton of CO2 emissions over the next 50 years. We have done every element of what we've done before. So we're not technology developers. We are executors. We know how to build what we've got in mind here, and that's the case we're on. So anyway, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. That's Brian Fair on the left, and Brian and I founded this company. And Brian is essentially he's a builder too. I think he's well known, way better known than I am in BC for sure. We both like working at scale, so we do big things. We like doing them. We started off both small. I started off as a welder, and Brian started off as a millwright. So we know how to make stuff with our hands, and we've advanced to some scale where we don't have to do that anymore. So anyway, I want to tell you about the story here. So Peak's Brine Company, he essentially knows everything about wood. He knows how to anything in the forest. Brian's an expert in. My company is on the right, called Northwest Capital Partners. We know pretty well everything about making things. We know everything about pipes, and so the two of us together know everything that we need to know to do this project. And so that's why we're excited about it, and that's why we're on the case of it. I'm having trouble figuring out I got a fancy new remote control here. It takes me a little while to learn how to do it. So we have been advancing a project up in Fort Nelson. We've been working with the Fort Nelson First Nation. This is what Chief Charlene Gale said about us. And our job is to provide the nation up there with enough information so that they can decide if they want to be partners with us. And we're working hard to do that right now. And it's a fair amount of work on something like this because it's a decent sized project. So myself, I believe that the energy transition is the opportunity of a lifetime, essentially the opportunity of a generation for Canada. And that's why I put the slide, the picture on the left of the CPR. That was the opportunity probably 2 generations ago. But our opportunity is we're going to have to transform the energy economy. We're going to have to do things in different ways. And the foundation of that is capturing and managing CO2. And there's great similarities between the CO2 system that we're going to have to build, that's going to have to go to every industrial site, and it's going to have to transport CO2 from those sites to places where we can put it underground safely and store it. So to me, there's great similarities and a great analogy with the railway. And I also think it's a really important opportunity for Indigenous people to be able to participate in that next, that next opportunity for Canada, the next generation opportunity. And both Brian and I are committed to delivering that opportunity. The only thing we know how to do is build stuff, and we can build things that are lasting, durable sources of employment in the places where we build them, and we're committed to doing that and committed to having Indigenous people as our partners. Sorry. My slide. Oh, there it is. Okay. So lots of people have been looking at emissions. We've all seen the graphs, and really what's happening is we're putting it in too fast. And because of the way we run our economy, we don't think we're going to be able to cut back the emissions that are going in the atmosphere as quickly as possible. We're going to have to figure out a way to take it out. So this is my little analogy here. If you think of the bathtub being the size of the Earth's atmosphere, we've been putting in CO2 in that bathtub. That's the tap we got running since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the rate's been going up and up. And we're all talking about, boy, we're going to have to cut back that, but we can't cut the tap back fast enough to stop the overflow. We're going to have to take CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Trees consume carbon dioxide from the air and concentrate that carbon into wood, making them an amazingly effective and natural direct air carbon capture tool. Trees are a renewable resource. In sustainably managed certified forests, trees are a great source of building products like lumber. However, in some areas, less than half of the fiber harvested ends up being used for solid wood products. The rest is usually burned or left behind to rot, with the carbon returning to the atmosphere. Utilizing the superpowers of this residual fiber is our ally in the fight against climate change. When we let carbon dioxide from the residual fiber return to the atmosphere, we squander a valuable opportunity to reduce carbon dioxide, or CO2, in our air. We also miss out on a source of clean, renewable energy. At Hydrogen Naturally, we believe that we can't afford to waste the tree's carbon sequestration work. We need to embrace it, and this is how we do it. Hydrogen Naturally uses the residual fiber left behind as feedstock for our facilities. Once delivered, the fiber is broken down into small chips and dried, recovering water, which is used later in the process. These chips are then put through an enclosed gasification process, converting fiber into sequestration-ready CO2 and carbon-negative hydrogen. We call this fuel bright green hydrogen because by utilizing the tree's hard work extracting CO2 from the air and permanently storing the carbon underground, the hydrogen we produce has a negative carbon footprint, making this product greener than green hydrogen. Our bright green hydrogen produces clean, carbon-negative products like electricity. Our large, bright green hydrogen supply will be essential in the transition to a carbon-free economy, making the world a better place, thinking 7 generations ahead. Technologically proven, Hydrogen Naturally is taking a lead role in decarbonizing the global economy. Each facility, over its life, will permanently remove more than 20 million tons of CO2 from the air. This is the emissions equivalent of removing more than 85,000 cars from our roads every year. That, in a nutshell, is how Hydrogen Naturally embraces the carbon-gathering superpowers of trees. We harness it to reduce atmospheric carbon while simultaneously producing awesome, sustainable, carbon-negative, bright green hydrogen. To learn more and to see in-depth explanations, visit hydrogennaturally.com.
So that's a plan, and I know a lot of this is going to sound aspirational, so I'd just like to give you a little bit an idea of stuff we've done before. This pie graph here, this is all the CO2 that's sequestered in Canada. Canada has been a very active place in terms of capturing and sequestering CO2. And I think I played a significant role in that. So anything that's green on here is something that I either founded, financed, operated, built, or invented. So I think the companies that I've started have done about 2/3 of this kind of work in Canada. So these are a few of the projects here. We designed and implemented something called the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. It's designed as a large utility system that captures carbon from a number of sources in Alberta. It started with the Sturgeon refinery, and it also picks up CO2 from a nutrient fertilizer plant and takes that down to central Alberta where it's stored. We put about 2 million tons in the ground down there in the last year or so. In the bottom right there's a picture of the Sturgeon Refinery. That's a project that I invented in my office, and it's in full operation now. And in the top right is Enhance. They're in charge of sequestering. So I was also involved in the Weyburn project, which was the first large-scale project done in Canada. I was an owner there and involved before we started sequestering CO2. It has now put about 35 million tons in the ground, I think. So that's a picture of the Sturgeon Refinery. It incorporates the largest blue hydrogen plant in the world. At this refinery, we make the bottom of the barrel, which is essentially all carbon. So the stuff that's left over from refining, we take to a gasifier and we make hydrogen and pure CO2 out of it. A gasifier can convert any form of carbon, it doesn't care what it is, and it convert that into CO2 that is pure and ready for sequestration, which is usually a really expensive step. And then it also produces hydrogen. So the whole message that I want to leave you with is trees are really good at capturing CO2. There isn't anything better. We don't think there'll ever be a man-made machine that will rival the carbon capture capabilities of a tree. And when the tree does that, we think it's really a shame to waste the work that the tree's done in doing that. Right now we do that. So we harvest trees for lumber. We do it in the most sustainable way, and we think Canada is amongst the best people in the world at doing it in a sustainable way, but we leave a lot behind. And the slash that we leave behind, we either leave on the ground to rot or we burn it, but either way, it ends up being back in the atmosphere. Nature magazine has said it takes about 10 years if we don't burn it, it takes about 10 years for that CO2 to get back in the atmosphere. So we can use this natural work and we can use it at large scale. So our plan is collect the fiber, gasify it using proven technology we know how to do, make hydrogen and CO2, sequester the CO2, and use the hydrogen for things that can be done with hydrogen today. And so there aren't very many of those kind of things, but we know how to do them all. Sorry. So our plan is really to follow the Henry Ford idea, the Model T, build a standard plant and then keep building it over and over. We think there's 50 places we can do this in North America. We think each plant will last about 50 years. And over that time, we'll make 20 million or sequester 20 million tons of CO2. And that CO2 came out of the atmosphere and we'll make about 1 billion kilograms of hydrogen. Standard plant costs about 1.2 billion. And we think by the time we get to plant 10, we'll be down at about half that. So that's some places that we've identified. There's good places everywhere, in many places in Canada. We think there's at least 3 good locations in BC. And then we've been trying to identify and talk to people that own other locations. So that's our vision. We're committed that the people in the areas where we build these things end up owning them. And we think they'll be majority owners. We will supply the operations capability and the support that a plant like this needs, but we will train people in the places where we work to run and own the plant. We want them as our partners. So we're going to do it at scale. We don't want to work on small things and we don't want to work on technology development. We think this is time to get going and actually do something. And we think in order to do that, we have to have proven technology. So we think North America, and particularly Canada, can be the center for this type of business, and we're committed to developing that. We're essentially air capture with carbon sequestration. So we hope that this is attractive to you. What we're trying to do is do the only things that Brian and I know how to do, which is build things that create significant employment in the areas where they're built, things that are durable and things that operate well and return capital to the people who built them. We're going to try and do that as many times as we can here. There's a bunch of problems to solve. We're working on them. Where does the hydrogen go is a question we get asked a lot. We actually have a good answer, and the answer is we can use the hydrogen internally in our process. And we plan to do that initially for drying, but we'll always have hydrogen available as other uses develop. We think it can go into fuel, it can go in, be blended in a natural gas supply, and it can go into electricity. So those are all ultimately places where we'll go, but we don't have to go there. One of the problems we got is the federal government's come out with new regulations, and we think we're air capture. We're not sure they do yet. We have to see if we can get them convinced of that. CCS, there isn't an enabling regulatory environment in BC yet. It's needed. And we know that people are working on it, but we're going to need this soon. And then we have to make sure that we fit with BC's LCFS and renewable gas regulations. So that's it. I ran over. I'm sorry. I don't talk fast enough.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Ian. Very interesting. Appreciate it. We're going to switch next to Alan Grant. Alan is Senior Energy Consultant for Kerwood Liddell Consulting Engineers. He's a seasoned executive with over 40 years of diversified management experience in the clean tech sector for both large companies and startups. Alan.
Thank you, Dave. I want to say to begin, it's Kerwood Liddell. We're pleased to be here and to participate in this conference, and also to be a coho level sponsor. Also like to acknowledge that we are in the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh unceded territory, and we're thankful to be here. So today I'm going to talk about a renewable energy study in Northwest British Columbia. We did this for FNCI last fall, and the reason we were looking at this is, as most people know, there are a number of LNG facilities under development or planned for Northwest BC. And an LNG facility, usually like the ones you would find down in Louisiana, or they use their natural gas feedstock and gas turbines to make electricity to run their facilities and create the LNG and load it. So what we're hoping for Northwest BC is to use renewable electricity or zero carbon electricity to make them net zero. So the first step is to figure out, do we have enough renewable energy in the area to be able to do this? So we did this study in Northwest BC. We used a variety of information sources, including BC Hydro's 2021 Integrated Resource Plan, and we found biomass, a lot of onshore wind, offshore wind, run-of-river, geothermal, and pump storage. And as you can see from the chart here, the onshore wind looks particularly attractive because it is actually cheaper than a gas turbine. So it's, and there's a lot of it. And there's even more offshore wind. And now that's more expensive, but wind generation in general and offshore in particular, we're seeing a dramatic decrease in the cost of that resource. The wind turbines, quite frankly, are just getting bigger and so more efficient. And so here's a map of the Northwest BC, and you can see from all of the offshore wind, there's a lot of offshore wind opportunities out there. And then onshore wind in the Central Plateau and in around Kitimat in that area. But, and then we've put in 2 LNG facilities, one at Prince Rupert, one up in the Nisga'a territory. And so one of the key things we need to do is, first of all, get the renewable energy, so in this case, let's say wind, from the point of generation to the point of use, i.e. the LNG facility. So for that, we need transmission. And also, one of the issues with renewable energy is it's a bit intermittent. The wind doesn't always blow. And so these LNG facilities need very firm or reliable wind. And they need the reliability up around 95, 98%. So transmission is very helpful with that. Some of those other resources, like we saw pump storage, is also helpful for that. In looking at the transmission, we looked at 2 transmission lines. So one at the sort of the middle of the slide here is you can see there's a solid red line. That's the existing 500,000 volt or 500 kV AC transmission line that runs from Prince George out to Terrace, and that serves the North Coast right now. In order to meet the very significant demands of these LNG terminals, we would need a second 500 kV AC or I guess that's an option, 500 kV AC transmission line from Prince George to Terrace. And then what we envisioned was a loop that would go from Terrace to Prince Rupert, up to New Ianche, and then back down to Terrace. And that would meet the needs of moving the renewable energy from generation to point of use, and would also provide, in the utility parlance, firming. Another option that we came across was to put in a 500,000 volt, 500 kV DC line. And that would go from the Kennedy substation up in northeast BC, up by Mackenzie, across to New Ianche. And then at that point, it would be transformed from DC power to AC power, and then put into that loop I described earlier. So these are with this in place, we could meet the needs of those LNG plants and keep them net zero. So one of the other issues on that is that, I guess there's a large renewable energy resource in Northwest BC. And we need support for zero LNG hydrogen and eventually hydrogen production and export. So first of all, it provides an opportunity and some challenges. So there's an opportunity there for First Nation owners, operators, partners, in development of the electricity generation, transmission, energy storage projects. One of the challenges is that we would require building transmission in advance of need. And so the transmission lines, when BC Hydro wants to build one, they have to go to the regulator, the BC Utilities Commission, and show them that they have enough need or demand in order to make it cost effective and not be onerous on the rest of the rate base. So they can't build it before the need arises. And then a transmission line of that size, it goes through regulation and environmental review, and then actually construction, and it can be up to 10 years. So if we want to align these transmission resources with this need from the LNG facilities and their building timeline, we need to build it in advance of need. So in order to do that, the governments of BC and Canada would have to step up and say, I am going to help finance this, or I'm going to allow you to build it in advance of need. Because we know the need's coming, it's in the pipe as it were, it's just not here yet. So there is precedent for that. So when the Northwest Transmission Line that goes north from Terrace up to Stewart and beyond, there wasn't enough need to justify that, and the provincial government stepped in and said, we want you to build it in advance of need. And I believe there was support from other levels of government as well. And as well, the Peace region did the same thing with the transmission line there. So there is a precedent for that. It also, in order to build this renewable energy, you need policy support to support renewable energy. So for example, there's the Smart Renewables and Electrification Pathways Program, or SREPS. That's with Natural Resources Canada, and it provides support for the co-funding and the development of renewable energy, and it supports the Government of Canada's climate change plan. In addition to that, there needs supported development for onshore and offshore wind development in the northwest BC, and with First Nations ownership. And then finally, it needs to be integrated with BC's climate plan and help drive this transition to low carbon. And as part of that, one of the things that everybody's looking at is that the net zero LNG in Northwest BC would be exported to Asia, where, as an earlier speaker said, they're burning a lot of coal for electricity generation. So this would displace that coal, and coal, of course, produces a lot more carbon when you combust it than does natural gas. So although you're going to be burning natural gas, there will be CO2 emissions. For every kilowatt hour of electricity you generate, the carbon footprint will be reduced. And if you have net zero LNG in Canada and you are displacing coal in Asia, you have a net negative GHG emissions, even though you're burning a fossil fuel. So that's my presentation for today. I look forward to the question period. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for that. Some really good information there, which I want to come back to. I don't think Stephen has joined us yet, so we're going to go straight to Q&A now with the panelists that are here. And if Stephen does join, he can join our panel. What I would maybe start with is the same place I started with the first panel, and you guys are a bit of different space, but Ian, I will ask you the same question I asked the first folks who had a different technology approach to the same end, which was to produce hydrogen. Like, why isn't it happening yet? And you talked all about the upsides and the opportunities. If you could speak to, you know, policymakers and investors and like what's missing? Why isn't it happening yet?
A few reasons, I think, Dave. Probably the first is there's kind of a divide. There's stuff that we know how to do today. It doesn't need any technology development. So it's things that are in the proven category, and they are financeable at scale, and they're all quite large. And so, in order to, there's scale effects with these things, and so you have to build big to have it make sense. So, the first project for us is about $1 billion. That has to be proven. You couldn't finance it unless it was. And the financiers want to know: do you have access? There's a robust credit market in BC, and we hope there'll be one soon in Canada for low carbon fuel standard or clean fuel standard. Do you have access to those? That's the first question they said, because that's going to be a significant part of your revenue stream. So that's the first thing that needs to, that we need to have assurances on, so that we can finance these things. And that's, I think, we're ready to go, except for that. I mean, we're doing, detailed engineering on the thing, but because we've done it before, we understand the economics of this already. And so we're different than somebody who's developing. Somebody who's developing, he's got to go through that phase, and he's got to get it to work. He's got to go through the, pilot plant, demonstration plant, commercial plant, and then he has to do all the things that we're doing. And so it just takes longer, I think.
Okay. So back to you, Alan.
Sure.
You made a compelling statement earlier about, the needs for governments to build it and they will come. Bit of a field of dreams statement there.
A little bit.
You gave some good examples, which I think are really relevant, especially NTL. But why haven't they yet? I mean, the opportunity seems clear. The upside has been talked about. Why haven't they started to do that yet? And
I
and
think
and what would it take?
I think it's a matter of priorities. There's a lot of competing demands, especially coming out of the COVID, and now with the war in the Ukraine, and everybody's got their hand out for some money. But I think that the time has come. I think that there's a recognition globally, and certainly within Canada and British Columbia, that there's a need for reconciliation. There's so doing projects that meaningfully involve First Nations, now is the time to be doing that. As well, climate change is not just coming, it's here. And we went through the heat dome last year and the floods last winter. And that's up close and personal, as some of the people talked about this morning. And so I think it's getting the attention of the public. And the public are saying, we need to do something about this. And this is something that would have this tripartite benefit, in that it would have a meaningful impact on climate change, both in BC and our climate change emissions in BC, and climate change globally with displacing coal in the Far East. It would provide employment. So it has all of the right things that government is looking for. And I think it's up to us now to make that link to say transmission lines are important. And it's not just a matter of putting money at it, and that's really important, but it's also looking at streamlining processes so that the processes are prudent. They cover the things that they need to cover, and that's why the processes are there, but not taking an overly long amount of time. So if we can fast track these, keep them credible with integrity, and get that built in time to support these projects, we won't have the project developers forced to build gas turbines, and that kind of defeats the purpose. And we've had this tremendous opportunity, and it's just this point in time. We've talked about this today in a number of different issues. It's a point in time where there's an opportunity, and it's time to do something.
Seems like a bit of a catch-22. Developers want to see the infrastructure, but the infrastructure is waiting for the developers. So let's come back to that maybe in a minute.
Well, I saw that when I was running the hydrogen program at BC Hydro too. Everybody, the car makers were saying, I need fueling stations, and the fueling companies were saying, I need cars.
Good example, and it's actually goes to your main point, which is how they're solving that problem in places like Japan. Is the government is taking on the task of subsidizing builds of the fueling stations, and then the cars are following, and it's fascinating. If you're ever in Tokyo, they're everywhere now, and it's quite interesting. A question online, still with you, Alan, says BC runs the risk of devoting too much power to LNG and starving northern critical minerals projects, which also need grid connected power. How do we get the transmission and generation capacity to do it all, basically? Are you worried about that?
As I used to be a resource planner at BC Hydro, so yeah, I'm very cognizant of that. And I think that the reinforcing the transmission infrastructure out there with another 500 kV line and this broader 500 kV loop does nothing but support that. Because it's not going to provide us enough transmission capacity to barely meet the LNG. It's going to be in excess of that, which will then provide that the transmission to the areas where it's needed. And it will then help foster the development of resource industries in Northwest BC.
Yeah, I think that's right. And as you know, I mean, in my last job, I was the deputy minister responsible for BC Hydro for a number of years. So I agree with that answer. And I would also say even further, for existing investments like the Northwest Transmission Line, building up that infrastructure you're talking about actually helps with the system overall and actually enhances the ability for more projects to exist off of NTL.
Exactly. And the technical, like the efficiency of the line, the capacity factors is how full do you fill the electricity pipe. And the more full it is, the more you're taking advantage of all of that invested capital and making it more efficient. So it actually makes those previous investments more efficient.
Exactly. Ian, another question online here says, the CCS piece is bigger than just oil and gas. There's also carbon mineralization that is not yet considered. How do we get that broader consideration and cooperation going?
Well, I think there are good carbon mineralization projects in BC. It's a good place to do those kind of projects. But what is the foundation of all this stuff is get the start of the system built. When we built the first 240 kilometers of line here in Alberta, it enabled a bunch of things along that line that couldn't happen, and it enables things that they're closer to it and something's going on. And then every time you put a ton of CO2 on an existing system, just like the power lines, the cost comes down. So the fuller it is, the cheaper it gets. And we just got to get, I think, the system started in a few places, and it'll grow organically from there to what makes the most sense. You just have to get it started.
Just looking at some of the other questions online here, talking about if we use up all our precious renewable electricity for these kinds of projects we're talking about, whether it's LNG or hydrogen or whatever, like, is that actually a good use of that? And I'm interested in both your takes, and it's too bad Stephen didn't make it, because for those of you that don't know, Stephen Appleton, who is supposed to be on this panel, represents green hydrogen project, which would have been a great contrast for all of the other ones we've heard about here today. And it's they're pursuing projects all over the world, all over Canada. There's one in BC they're looking at, which is a gigawatt scale electrolyzer in Prince George. And so there's a good example. Is that a good use of our renewable electricity? Is there going to be enough left to do what you're talking about, Alan? Or what about the cars and all the other infrastructure we're trying to create here? So I'm interested in both your perspectives on, best use for our precious 100% renewable, firm dispatchable energy, especially. So Alan.
Well, I think that the nice thing about the BC Hydro system is with the existing reservoirs, we've got a lot of firm dispatchable energy there. And one of the challenges with most people's grids, like you saw in Northern Europe, is you introduce a lot of wind into it, it makes it less stable, and you have to put in other generation to help firm it up. We've got that already. And so it can enable the firming of that renewable energy so that it can be used for a wide range of things. And I don't know that it's ever good to try and gate this and say, we're going to pick and choose which industries get the electricity and which don't. I think there's enough out there for everything. And I think we're blessed with this ton of renewable energy, as our project shows. And with the firming ability of the reservoirs, it brings this whole other resource into the mix. If we don't put in that renewable energy, the intermittent renewables, then we're looking at other rivers to dam, and that has an environmental impact. Even if it's sort of a run-of-river like Site C, it has an environmental impact. So let's make the most use of what we've already done there, bring in the new renewable, and that's enough to, with the transmission that we've now put in place from Prince George to the Lower Mainland, to really help drive this green economy. And there are very few other places in the world that have this abundance of resource that they are able to do this and don't have to pick and choose.
Ian, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are hydrogen is an energy carrier. It's not an energy source. It's a way to, make one form of energy into a form that I can move around. So if there's a reason to convert it to a different kind of carrier, I completely get it. But if I'm taking really valuable dispatchable electricity and then I'm making it into another carrier, so instead of moving an electron, I'm moving some other kind of molecule, I'm moving a molecule around somewhere else to use it, then I have to look at the friction. How much did I lose in that conversion process? And I don't really understand the reason about why you would want to do that. I mean, maybe I'm too much of an engineer, but I don't understand that. That doesn't make sense to me. If I can put electron on a wire, I can get the wires everywhere. I can bring it out where I need it. That's a really wonderful thing to have, and few people in the world have that fully renewable as BC is. So I'm not sure why I want to take that really great energy and make it into another kind of energy.
I understand where Ian's coming from here, and I agree that we want to be as efficient in our systems as possible. But I think that electricity for heavy-duty transportation, like I've just spent 10 years putting batteries into ships, and they're really good for short-run ships. Say 40-minute run on a ferry, they work super well, and for passenger automobiles. But for long-haul trucks, for big ships, their batteries do not have the energy density to be able to get the job done. So you can't just put electricity into a battery with a good round-trip efficiency. And hydrogen is coming up as one of the best uses for that. And I think your project is a great way to do that. And I think that renewable hydrogen from electrolysis can be a great way to do that as well. I don't know that we would pick and choose one or over the other. We want to let the market decide what is the most efficient manufacturing method, but we need a lot of hydrogen to decarbonize these other heavy-duty transportation modes.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, maybe we're going to wind up this panel now, so I'll just ask you guys for any closing thoughts, especially. I like one of the questions that was asked earlier about, if you were to fast forward yourself and put yourself in the year 2060 and looking backwards now, how would you think that new energy systems have evolved in practical ways to get us kind of from where we are today to where we want to be in the future? So, Alan?
I think we have to be prepared that the general public have a lot of things going on in their life. So what they're saying is, I want one thing that fixes everything. And the challenge is it wasn't one thing that messed up everything. So I think we have to look at the fit for use. So I think electric cars running on batteries, lithium batteries, make a whole lot of sense. And hydrogen for heavy duty transportation makes a whole lot of sense. Electricity, you make it based on where you live. And I think renewable sources and CCS for carbon emissions, I think it's going to be all of these different modes of energy carriers and energy sources that are going to get us where we need to go. And it's going to be incremental. I think we're going to go to fuels that are more efficient and less carbon. And over time, we will transition to zero carbon. And at the same time, and in parallel, we'll try to ramp up the zero carbon energy so we can get where we're going and meet those climate change goals in time.
Okay, thanks. Ian?
What I would say is just everything in this business, there's so much investment and so much sunk capital that everything has to be evolutionary. So we can make changes, and we should always focus on making the best changes first. And if we don't do that, I worked in the wind energy business back in 1978. And it's taken a long time to get to, 5 megawatt, 10 megawatt machines. It's taken that long to get to machines that are really economic. And it's just an evolutionary process. I build some, I put them up and find out what goes wrong. The same thing is going to happen with all this transition stuff. And what I think is the new technology stuff is great, and we should be spending a lot of money on it. But we should also be spending a significant portion of our budget to the next best thing and the next best thing after that that we know how to do and we're not inventing, because sometimes inventing takes a long time.
Thank you, and thank you both for your time on this panel. And with that, we'll bring this part of the agenda to a close. Thank you both.
Okay.
Thank you, Dave.
So I'm on the agenda here to do a bit of a sum up on this, and I think we may end a bit early on this part of the agenda too. But what I'll try to do is give you my thoughts and also try to tie together what we've heard in the last couple of panels here. So I think first of all, the importance of this conference can't be overstated. It's really important timing, and the questions I was asking about why aren't things happening and what do we need to do are questions we need to be asking, but more importantly we need to start answering and helping governments to answer, because I really am seeing for a wide variety of reasons a new and slightly different conversation starting around energy and the energy transition. I'll come back to that. The energy transition itself is a fascinating topic because what's happening as the world kind of comes out of COVID, and we'll see what sort of moderating effects inflation have and potential future shutdowns. But the world is starting to use more and more energy post COVID. Just as it did post the economic recession of 2008-9. And why I put that in context of the energy transition is one of the things that actually maybe will start one day is an actual transition writ large. And that's a bit provocative, but let me explain. The overall use of energy globally is growing by any credible measure. And as supplies of renewables try to keep up, they're challenged. They're challenged in two ways, both intermittency, as we've seen most recently in the UK when the wind stopped blowing for a couple months, but they're also challenged in just sheer capacity. The growth of needs of the world for energy is growing faster than renewables can keep up. So yes, two things can be true at the same time. Renewables are growing fantastically, exponentially, and coming down in cost and continue to grow. But the worldwide global demand for energy is growing faster. So not only are they, so that's what I mean by an energy transition. We need to start turning over the growth of curve such that we can start to fill that growth with the renewables as they come out and as we try to firm them up. So that's first point that I think is one of the data points I just wanted to put out there. Another data point that I think is really important is the easy spots are gone for solar and for wind. There's easier places to permit and there's harder places to permit. There's less expensive places to go and more expensive. The easy, cheap places are mostly gone. And so it's getting harder and more expensive to site projects, and they're getting more expensive. And as the cost of critical minerals goes up, like RJ was talking about, that's just going to become more and more of an issue. We may have seen for a while we may see the bottoming out of the curve of cost of solar PVs, for example, because of the cost of minerals as inputs. So there's another data point that's kind of important to the conversation. Why does all that matter? Because it reintroduces what else is there. And what we're seeing happen, and it's happening today because of some of these energy demand needs I talked about earlier, coal is making a comeback. There's coal plants coming back online. Coal plants are not being decommissioned at the rates we would have seen before. Why is that? People need energy and they care about the climate, but they care more about the energy being there when they need it for industry, for homes, for all of those kinds of uses. And so because there's a struggle for alternatives, the cheapest, easiest, and dirtiest things sometimes come back into the mix, and that is happening. You're seeing that. So all of that is to say, well, what else could it be? It could be LNG. And I think we have a story to play in Canada there, and we want to talk about that, and hydrogen, which we've talked a lot about in these two panels, and how are those things going to come forward in a way that don't force people to have that discussion around, well, do I need to choose the environment or can I choose this energy system, LNG, hydrogen, whatever it is, and is it clean and consistent with my environmental desires? So those are all things we need to be thinking about. When it comes to Canada and our ability here to solve some of those problems, it's a really interesting question because right now, and we heard it clear as a bell, Canada has a lot of advantages. What we're not good at is exploiting those advantages. And, there's a global understanding. We have this multitude of natural resources here, but it's also true that globally, people don't believe we can actually build these projects and get it done. And so when it comes to reliability as a supplier, that's a hugely important point. And it's, where the roles of government and others come in. And I'll come back to that too. So I'm going to maybe bring all of that together in my personal view of where our core advantage as a nation exists and how it relates here. Is I always like to think of this problem as a three-legged stool, and you need all three legs for the stool to stand up. But if you do all three at once, I think it's a compelling story. The first leg of the stool is environmental. We shouldn't be building these things if they're not consistent with our Canadian environmental desires, and those are broadly understood. Like we want to be environmentally responsible as Canadians. We want to be leaders. We want to show the way. So these projects have to be net zero. They have to be electrified. They have to be built and operated in a way that doesn't pollute the land or the air or the water. So those core environmental things are one thing. They've got to be economical. You can't build things that aren't in the money. And I think the interesting thing of energy prices going up the way they have is it makes a lot of projects much more doable, and that they be very environmentally respectful. So I think you can build environmentally respectful projects that are economically smart and in the money. So leg one and leg two. And I would argue the most important leg of the stool is the Indigenous angle. So I don't think it's possible, nor should it be possible, to build these projects in future without Indigenous leadership and participation and meaningful ownership benefits flowing back to the nations. I think that it is, as I said earlier, the way we need to differentiate ourselves. ESG is talked about everywhere. Everybody wants to talk about the environmental carbon intensity of this and environmental that. Like I already said, important leg, but the social part of ESG, I think, is going to get its day in the sun. And I think in Canada, that's going to go right to my point. And I think, companies everywhere and buyers of these commodities everywhere need to be asking themselves, how is the Indigenous population treated during the production of this thing, whether it's a mineral or LNG or hydrogen or whatever it is? And that needs to matter. It needs to matter as much, if not more, than the environmental part of ESG. And I think as that becomes more and more true, you're going to see the importance of Canada and its approach on this issue and the point of this conference really coming into focus. So that's my view. You feel free to agree or disagree, but I think that when you marry all those three legs of the stool up and you look at the doability, the investability, the permittability, the ability for Canadians broadly and governments broadly to get behind these kind of projects and ideas we have, where's the problem if all three of those legs are true? So with that, I'll end my comments there and bring this portion to a close. Thank you very much.